Hi, welcome back. This is part 2 of your video lecture on Chapter 24, An Affluent Society, 1953 to 1960. In this section, I will be dealing with the Eisenhower era. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president from 1953 to 1961. So this first section, discussing the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower to the presidency. So Ike. He's known as Ike. I like Ike is his campaign slogan, one of the great campaign slogans of American political history. So he is going to come out of World War II as kind of the guy. Nobody really knows much about his politics, but everybody wants him to be a candidate. There's a long tradition in American history of electing victorious generals to the presidency, beginning with Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor. Andrew Jackson, who had been a hero of the War of 1812, Zachary Taylor, who had been a hero of the Mexican War, Ulysses S. Grant, who had been a hero of the Civil War. So this is something that has a long history. So everybody wants Ike. Nobody really knows what he believes or which party he is going to be part of. Both parties approached him in 1952 wanting him to be their candidate. He would choose to run as a Republican because he believed that the person who would be the Republican nominee, if he did not accept the Republican invitation, that person was Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, and Eisenhower believed that he would lead the U.S. back to isolationism. So he chose to run as a Republican. So he's the Republican nominee. He chooses as his running mate Richard Nixon, a California congressman, and who had made his name as an anti-communist, being a part of the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, pursuing Alger Hiss as a communist spy, and other things. So he is a shrewd politician. He is going to use his talents as a politician and to use populist language to promote free market economics. He's going to help to transform the Republican Party's image from defender of big business to the defender of the forgotten man, the hardworking citizen who is overly burdened by government regulation and a heavy burden of taxes, and unable to get help from unresponsive government bureaucracies. So Ike and Nixon are going to be campaigning. The 1952 campaign is going to be the first campaign to rely heavily on television advertising. As soon as he becomes the vice presidential nominee, Nixon's going to run into a scandal when there are allegations that he had that wealthy Californians had put a lot of money into a private fund for his family, that he's using his office to enrich himself. There was consideration of dropping him from the ticket and choosing another vice president, but Nixon would go on TV in what's known as the checkers speech to vigorously deny the allegations. And in that speech, he would talk about his ordinary upbringing. He wasn't from a wealthy family, his record in World War II, and he's going to deny the accusations, except he said the only gift he would acknowledge receiving was his dog, Checkers. Yes, that had been a gift, but he wasn't going to give him up. It rescued his political careers, and it showed how impactful a televised speech could be in influencing political campaigns. Eisenhower is incredibly popular. Like, everybody likes Ike. I mean, he won World War II. What's not to like? His opponent, Democrat Adlai Stevenson, is going to, as you can see from this campaign poster, he's very much going to try to tie Eisenhower to Herbert Hoover. Say, hey, you vote for You vote for Eisenhower, you're going to get what you got from Hoover: breadlines, homelessness, and closed banks. You want the party of Roosevelt, which gave you higher wages, better homes, and Social Security. It's not successful. People are sufficiently removed by this point from the Depression to for that not to be a terribly effective call. And, Eisenhower is such a uniquely popular candidate that he's going to even make inroads in the Democratic South, winning the election handily. I don't know if you can see this really well. He won 55% of the popular vote, 83% of the electoral vote, even winning formerly Confederate states of Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, and Florida. So he will actually go up against Adlai Stevenson twice, both in 1952 and in 1956, winning both races. And just even though Eisenhower is incredibly popular, that's not going to translate to a strong Republican majority. He doesn't have coattails. Coattails is a political term used when a candidate helps other candidates of his same party win down ballot. He doesn't have coattails. Republicans will win a slight majority in 1952, but Democrats will win Congress back in 1954 and remain in control. So it's going to be split control of government. In 1956, he will be the first president to be reelected without his party, or just elected, period, not just reelected, elected without his party winning control of Congress. So he's going to usher in modern republicanism. The tone in Washington is going to change. He's going to be a champion of the business community and a fiscal conservative, but he's going to accept New Deal programs like Social Security, scale back government spending where possible, but accepting that New Deal programs like Social Security are here to stay. He said, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. So he calls his political agenda modern republicanism, and he is going to retain core New Deal programs as well as expanding them. He is going to implement some aspects of a mixed economy, not to the extent that it existed in Europe. A mixed economy is one where there is free enterprise, but still government playing a major role in planning Europe economic activity. So the United States is going to keep a more limited welfare state. It is not going to put major industries in the control of the government, but there is going to be government spending to promote productivity and boost employment. The interstate highway system is going to be the biggest public works project in American history. It's going to cost billions of dollars to build. It's going to be built. It's going to be justified as a Cold War necessity, a defense necessity. It was claimed, defense necessity, that's the word I want. It was claimed that it was needed to both transport troops in the event of any type of invasion, as well as facilitate the evacuation of major cities in the event of nuclear strikes. So that is going to provide, there's plenty of support otherwise, though, from automobile manufacturers, oil companies, suburban builders, and construction unions, all supported highway construction. In 1957, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth is launched by the Soviet Union. Yikes, the commies are beating us. Oh no. So in response to the launch of Sputnik, that inspires quite a panic in the United States that the Russians are passing us in technology. And so in response to that, so let me just indicate, Sputnik was Russian. It means fellow traveler, by the way, in Russian. Sputnik does. In response to that, the Eisenhower administration is going to propose and get passed the National Defense Education Act, which is going to offer direct federal funding to higher education to ensure that we can keep up with the Russians in terms of education and technology. That concern is seen in this cartoon from New Yorker magazine, in which a father is telling his son, "Do you call a C- catching up with Russia? No, we need better education, better grades if we're going to keep up with those dang commies." In terms of labor relations, there's a new social contract between labor and business. Unions will sign long-term agreements trying to prevent unauthorized strikes. Employers, in turn, will grant wage increases and fringe benefits, such as private pension plans, health insurance, and cost of living raises. The benefits of the social contract are pretty much, it will bring some benefits to non-union workers, but those are limited, and most workers who are not in unions are not going to gain those same benefits. And the labor movement and the social contract will weaken by the end of the 1950s with strikes and attempts to limit wage increases in some industries. In terms of foreign policy, nuclear brinksmanship would become a defining aspect of the 1950s. Both the United States and the USSR are going to develop even greater weapons of mass destruction. The first hydrogen bomb, in contrast to the atomic bomb, the first hydrogen bomb is going to be tested by the United States in 1952. It's going to be many times more powerful with much more destructive force than the weapons used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. Less than a year later, the USSR is going to test its own hydrogen bomb. That will set off an arms race as each side wants to make sure that it can ensure that it has as many bombs as the other. So both the United States and the USSR are going to be developing fleets of long-range bombers. This is the 1950s. Missile technology was not sufficient yet to allow for nuclear missiles, so any nuclear bombs would have to be delivered by plane. So there is a fleet of long-range bombers on both sides. And so as a defense mechanism, both the United States and Russia are going to work on detection technology. Alaska is going to become the site of what's known as the DEW line, Defense Early Warning System, a system of radar stations that are going to be placed there in the hopes of detecting any long-range bombers before they reach the United States in time to either be intercepted or for the United States to launch its own long-range bombers to retaliate against the Soviet Union. And that doctrine, massive retaliation, is going to become a major part of Cold War doctrine. Now, the development of nuclear weapons is going to become the centerpiece of U.S. defense spending. And in fact, the size of the armed forces is going to be greatly reduced, but the number of nuclear weapons in existence is going to be increased. And this doctrine of massive retaliation said that any Soviet attack, not just on the United States, but on an American ally, would be countered by nuclear assault on the Soviet Union. By thus emphasizing nuclear weapons in the United States' arsenal, it does allow for the reduction of conventional weapons and reduce the necessity for keeping a large standing army. If we're going to let our nukes do the talking, we don't need all these soldiers and conventional weapons. So the size of the armed forces is going to fall nearly by half during the Eisenhower administration. Now, massive retaliation, starting a nuclear war in response to any threat, it leaves open the possibility for miscalculation, for misunderstanding, for horrific consequences for any mistake. And in some ways, that reality led to a much more careful relationship between the United States and the USSR, because both countries understood that any mistake, even the slightest little hint of anything in their relations, direct contact with each other, would result in mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It was the knowledge, the sure understanding that any attack would result in the complete destruction of both the United States and the Soviet Union. And so it made them much more careful, but it did lead to an atmosphere of fear. There was an emphasis by the government for Americans to build bomb shelters in their backyards. School children practiced the duck and cover technique. And these programs were aimed at ensuring people believed that a nuclear war would be survivable, but it did contribute to an overall atmosphere of fear among Americans. When it came to dealing with the Soviet Union, Eisenhower is greatly helped because in 1953, Stalin dies. And that ushers in what Eisenhower hopes is going to be a new era in U.S.-Soviet relations. The ending of this Korean War, they were no longer in direct conflict with communism, and the death of Stalin, Eisenhower believes we can deal with the Soviets on conventional diplomatic terms. So in 1955, he's going to meet with Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader of the Soviet Union. And in 1956, Khrushchev is going to do something kind of extraordinary. He is going to go before the Communist Party Congress in Moscow, and he is going to give a speech that was earth-shaking. In that speech, Khrushchev is going to essentially say, so Stalin was kind of awful. No, he was really bad. He was honest about Stalin's atrocities. He acknowledged the purges of the 1930s in which literally millions of people were murdered or imprisoned sometimes for no crime at all, and sometimes simply for the crime of not agreeing with Stalin enthusiastically enough. And so that open acknowledgement is going to both bring hope to the United States and to Eisenhower that Khrushchev is going to do things differently, that there's going to be a major change in the Soviet Union. It's also going to shatter the reputation of communism in the rest of the world. It's going to create a crisis of belief among other communists in the rest of the world, especially in the United States. 3/4 of the remaining members of the U.S. Communist Party would renounce their membership once it was acknowledged and understood and undeniable how blind they had been to the true nature of Stalin's rule, because they had been supporting him. They had been believing in him, and then it comes out he was actually doing horrible things. So all of this leads to the hope that there can be a thaw. In that same speech, Khrushchev is going to call for peaceful coexistence with the United States. There's a hope that there can be an easing of the Cold War. However, in that same year, Hungarian nationalists are going to attempt to rise up and throw off the communist government of Hungary. Hungary was not part of the Soviet Union. It was an independent country, but it had a strongly communist government, and that was directly allied with the Soviet Union. When an uprising in Hungary tried to throw off that communist government, the Soviet Union sent in tanks and troops and brutally suppressed that rebellion. This was met with, there was a desire among many, especially Republicans in the United States, to support the anti-communist forces, rebels in Hungary. And because we had been encouraging people to throw off communist rule, and when people throw off communist rule and then they're being attacked and murdered in the streets, it kind of looks bad. But Eisenhower's not willing to directly confront Soviet forces in that way, and so relations are little tense. Both of the superpowers in 1958 would agree to a voluntary halt of the testing of nuclear weapons because people have finally gotten some attention. They've been waving their arms, screaming from the back of the room, "Hey, stop exploding nukes everywhere. It's bad for people." Because there really had not been a full realization of the detrimental nature, the ongoing negative effects of radiation and the impact it would have on the environment, on people's health. So in 1959, Khrushchev is going to come to the United States, tour Camp David, tour the United States and meet with Eisenhower at Camp David in Maryland. But in 1960, the Soviets are going to shoot down an American spy plane, the U-2 spy plane. So the U-2 plane is a very high altitude plane, and it's equipped with a very advanced camera that is able to take clear pictures of things on the ground. It flew at very high altitudes above 70, 80,000 feet, what was believed to be out of radar and out of missile range by the Soviet Union. Now, the U.S. thought that it was out of radar range. It wasn't. The Soviets knew perfectly well that these flights were going on, but they couldn't really do anything about it. But these flights have been going on for years. They had provided a lot of really, really good intelligence for the United States. But the Soviets were not just sitting there, wringing their hands about these flights. They were working on missiles that could reach that high and hit those planes. Finally, in 1960, this was just one last flight, because the Americans were actually about to stop these flights. But one last flight, we just need a little more information. And that flight, the Soviets were tracking that flight of the U-2 from the 15 minutes before it reached Soviet airspace. They knew it was coming. They were tracking it, and they shot a missile, several anti-aircraft missiles that reached it, caused it to crash. Now, the pilots of the U-2 plane were technically civilians, although Francis Gary Powers, the pilot of that fateful U-2 flight, was had been an Air Force pilot. He had been temporarily reassigned to the CIA. It's a whole complicated thing, but all of those pilots had instructions to hit a self-destruct button that would ensure that the classified parts of the plane would be destroyed. Powers was not able to do that before he ejected from the plane. Also, the CIA was pretty sure that a pilot would not be able to survive a crash at the altitudes that the planes flew at. They were pretty sure that anything that caused the plane to crash would also kill the pilot. So they really didn't think that any pilot could survive if the Soviets could shoot it down. Well, Powers survived, but the U.S. didn't know that. So the plane crashes. The U.S. announced, and the Soviet Union doesn't say anything. So the Americans figure, well, obviously he's hit the self-destruct, so all the classified and obviously spying parts of the plane have been destroyed and won't be recognizable, and the pilot's dead. Yes, unfortunately, a weather research plane from NASA unfortunately got lost, detoured over Soviet airspace, and then crashed accidentally. It's a tragedy. The pilot was killed. And that's the story they presented to the entire world. Except the Soviets had a largely intact plane with very obvious spy equipment on it, and they had a live pilot who had been immediately captured and interrogated, who had, given up some information about the plane and his mission. And so the Soviet Union let the United States go public with the weather research plane story, spread it all over the world, and then at a summit, the Khrushchev announced the evidence that it was a spy plane and demanded an apology. That was really embarrassing for the United States. It was a huge black eye for the United States on the world stage. They were caught lying. They were caught spying. All of this is really bad. A bad look for the Americans. It would torpedo relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. For Francis Gary Powers, the pilot, he would spend several years in prison in the Soviet Union before finally being exchanged for a Soviet spy who had been caught in the United States, who went by the name Rudolf Abel. That wasn't his real name, but it's the name that he used. They would actually be swapped on a bridge in East Berlin, or in Berlin. So if you ever get the chance to watch the movie Bridge of Spies, starring Tom Hanks, it's a really good movie, and it covers both the U-2 incident and the capture of Abel, and then the negotiations to exchange them. Really good movie, gives you kind of a good picture of some of those Cold War tensions. So if you ever are interested in a movie, that's a good one. So throughout the rest of the world that's not the Soviet Union or the United States, it becomes kind of known as the Third World. This is not necessarily referring to development. Today, the use of the term Third World countries is often considered derogatory, and it's considered kind of an inappropriate term in some circles now to use, but it didn't originate as in meaning less developed or anything like that, and it originated in terms of political alignment. You had the United States, the First World. You had the United States, NATO countries, and its allies. You had the Soviet Union and its communist allies, and then you had the rest of the world. And they considered themselves the Third World. They're not aligned with either. There is a lot of decolonization going on. And these developing countries, they don't want to align with either one. They want to chart their own path. They don't necessarily want to go full-on free enterprise capitalism. They see some aspects of socialism that they think will be beneficial. They also don't want to go full-on communist. So they want to chart their own path. The Bandung Conference in 1955, leaders of 29 Asian and African nations would meet in Indonesia to announce the emergence of this Third World, a new force in global affairs that represented, in fact, a majority of the world's population. So influencing this is going to be the vacuum, the power vacuum of decolonization. The United Kingdom is going to, but in the 1950s, there is going to be a raft of British colonies in Africa that are going to become independent nations, beginning with Britain's Gold Coast colony in 1957, becoming the new nation of Ghana. New nations that are emerging in the 1950s, Indonesia becomes an independent nation. Malaysia, independence. Nigeria, Kenya, independence, and Tanzania, all becoming independent nations from having been colonies of European nations. In 1975, Portugal is going to grant independence to Mozambique and Angola. So this is going to make foreign affairs much more complex. All of these new nations, they have kind of a power vacuum. They're no longer under the control of European colonizers, and they're seen by the United States as being very vulnerable to potential Soviet influence. The Soviet Union had been very vocal about its about its desire to see colonization end. And so there is a fear that these nations will accept communist influence, possibly communist rule. But most of them are going to resist being aligned with either of the major power blocs, trying to remain neutral. Many of the nationalists in these nations are going to greatly admire the United States, but in most ways, they're going to try to chart their own path. So in the Third World, that's where the focus of the Cold War is going to go in the 1950s. With the division of Europe seeming to be set in stone. The policy of containment is going to continue, and is, instead of being just focused on communism, it's going to shift to being marked by opposition to any government that seems to threaten American strategic or economic interests. The Suez Fiasco. In the Suez Fiasco, Britain, France, and Israel are going to invade Egypt in 1956 after nationalist Egyptian leader Gamal Nasser is going to nationalize, meaning seize, the Suez Canal, which was owned by Britain and France. They had built it. They still operated it. He's going to seize it for Egyptian control. They invade without consulting the United States, and Eisenhower's really mad that they do that because they're kind of destabilizing the whole world. He's going to basically twist their arms to abandon their invasion, and he's going to put the United States into the position of being the power broker in the Middle East. And his new Eisenhower Doctrine is going to pledge that the United States is going to defend any Middle Eastern governments that are threatened by either communism or Arab nationalism in the form of Nasser. And when I say any, I do want to just briefly mention a couple of instances of the policy of containment being used against non-communist seeming threats. One is a CIA-sponsored military coup in Guatemala to overthrow the government of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, and a CIA-sponsored coup in Iran to overthrow the government of Mohammad Mossadegh, who were nationalist governments in Guatemala. Guzman was wanting to do land reform that would threaten the United Fruit Company, an American fruit company, and Mossadegh nationalized the British-owned Anglo-Iranian oil company. And so both of those leaders would be overthrown by CIA-sponsored coups. This lecture is getting long, so I'll let this be my last slide. I'll just really quickly talk about the origins of the Vietnam War, which are going to be rooted in the 1950s. After World War II, the Japanese are expelled from Vietnam. They had conquered Vietnam. They're going to be expelled. Vietnamese nationalist forces, led by Ho Chi Minh, are going to hope that they can gain independence from France in the aftermath of World War II. France does not want to lose control of its valuable colony there in what had been known as French Indochina. And so the late 1940s and early 1950s are going to be a time of severe conflict as the French try to hold on to their empire. The U.S. had Eisenhower followed Truman administration policy in supporting the French in this goal, and the U.S. is taking on more and more of the burden for this French war. By the early 1950s, the U.S. is paying 4/5 of the cost of this war that the French are fighting to maintain their colonial holdings at a time when decolonization is sweeping the world. So the French, it's soon not enough for the United States to be providing financial support. They want the U.S. to involve its troops and fight on France's side as well. Eisenhower declines. The French continue to lose ground, and soon the French forces in Vietnam were trapped in what became known as the Dien Bien Phu Triangle. They were basically surrounded, And the French government was like, hey, Eisenhower, U.S., you guys, you've got all those tactical nukes. You want to use them to help us out here? And Eisenhower's like, start a nuclear war to help you hang on to your colony. Don't think so. No, actually, thanks for the offer, but we're good. We're not actually going to drop nukes on Vietnam for you guys. No. So after the U.S. declined to nuke the Vietnamese, the French had to basically agree to Vietnamese independence. The Geneva Accords were signed in 1954, and they divided Vietnam temporarily into northern and southern districts. The north led by Ho Chi Minh, the south led by the Catholic Ngo Dinh Diem. That is my best attempt at pronunciation. I'm terrible at pronouncing Vietnamese names. I apologize. I'm working on it, but that's the best I can do. He's the South Vietnamese leader. He is Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country. He is the leader of South Vietnam. Elections were supposed to be held in 1956, which would unify the country under one leader. But Ngo Dinh Diem is not willing to allow elections to go forward because he's pretty sure that Ho Chi Minh, who is a communist, will win. The fact that Ho Chi Minh was a communist meant that they were on the side of the South Vietnamese. So he refuses to hold elections. There is a full-scale guerrilla revolt going on by 1960 as forces supported by Ho Chi Minh are waging a guerrilla warfare against the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. U.S. is supporting the Dien Diem regime with lots and lots of money because we got to defeat the communists, and this financial support will translate into military advisors, will translate into troops, laying the groundwork for the Vietnam War. So the U.S. is becoming accustomed to intervening in far-flung corners of the world. I will stop this here and pick up in my next lecture talking about the critics of the mass society.